I'm Peter Marks, theater critic of The Washington Post.
And I'm Elisabeth Vincentielli, and I write for the New York Times. And my gosh, Peter, we're here again talking about theater because we have nothing better to do, right?
Yeah, only writing four articles a week. Yeah, I mean,
That's right.
It's that time of year. Well, but it doesn't matter how many other things I have to do. I always love doing this with you, Elisabeth. And I think we found the rhythm for this project in bringing on every time interesting people from the world we cover. I think it really helps enlarge our world to have really interesting voices. And I never tire of asking questions and getting the responses from these wonderful guests.
And today we're looking at theater from a very different perspective. We've talked to actors, directors, producers. We've talked to a set designer. I mean, the list is long. But today we're talking to an author who has very deep and fascinating roots in the theater world. And our guest today is Priscilla Gilman, whose newly published memoir, The Critic's Daughter, is receiving great reviews pretty much everywhere. Reviews a Broadway show can only envy, I would say.
Indeed. Yeah. The quote ads would be lengthy.
The marquee is huge.
Yes. Priscilla is the daughter of a renowned critic, the late Richard Gilman. He was a longtime journalist, a reviewer for Newsweek, and of course a revered teacher, theater world knows this well, at the Yale School of Drama, among other places, who wrote a seminal book that everyone in the theater world also knows, The Making of Modern Drama. I read it many years ago and was, of course, intimidated and blown away by Richard's knowledge and insights. Her mother is the very much alive Lynn Nesbit, a literary agent to everyone you have ever heard of. I was stunned, actually, by the list, even of people that Priscilla mentions, including Toni Morrison, Robert Caro, Michael Crichton, for goodness sakes. The childhood she led with her sister Claire on the Upper West Side was breathtakingly rich, to be envied, I guess, in a way, by anybody who knows the names of the people that came across her doorstep. And literally at the hub of New York's literature and theater worlds.
So we're going to talk about what it was to be a critic's daughter at that particular time. And you had just mentioned that Richard Gilman was theater critic at Newsweek. That's when Newsweek had a staff theater critic. I don't think that has been the case in a long time now.
Right.
And that says it all. Like when theater, I don't know if the theater critic has ever been on the cover of Newsweek, but like it was not inconceivable as it is now. I think at that time
there were cover stories about theater.
Maybe there could have been. So yeah, the place of drama and criticism were much different at that time, the place they held in the landscape.
True. So let's welcome Priscilla, and congratulations on The Critic's Daughter, which I would say is a deeply perceptive portrait of your mother, your father, and you.
Thank you, Peter.
Yeah, the title is descriptive, but some people might think it's an identity that doesn't take you fully into account. Why did you pick that title? And I guess that's a way of discussing, why now you brought this book forward.
Peter, I love that question because the title also doesn't really do justice to my father. I quote in the book from the 1970 New York Times article about he was directing a play at the Yale Repertory Theater, and someone asked him about why he was directing now. And he said, I don't consider myself a critic or a teacher, or I consider myself all these different things. And the title came to me. I knew I wanted to write a book about my father. I also initially thought about writing a book about his cohort of critics, including Stanley Kaufman, who's a big character in the book, and Anatole Breillat, all of the literary critics and the theater critics that he was friends with and worked with. And, the title came to me in the middle of the night. It really was one of those movie moments where I woke up in the middle of the night and I was like, The Critic's Daughter. I lost my father for the first time when I was 10 years old. It just came to me like that. And I never questioned it after that. But when I found that quote where he talked about not wanting to be considered a critic, I thought, Oh my gosh. And the book is, of course, all about not being reductive about people's identities, about accepting people and writers, playwrights in their full complexity with all of their many facets.
I think that that's one of the things I love about the book is we also reductively think about critics as a certain kind of person.
Exactly.
As, kind of like eggheads or people with, very little life outside of the world of a theater, yes, as kind of curmudgeonly or, needing to get back at the world because the world didn't give them something, and they get that through their judgmental take on other people. But you provide a very rich picture of the people that populated your childhood world and beyond through your parents. And they were, full-blooded people. And your father, obviously, was so redolent of Jewish New York, the way you describe him as like a lover of Delhi and the Giants and, with the poker games, almost like out of The Odd Couple. There's a much more complex and both human and interesting character that comes through as a result.
I love that, Peter. And my father was not a failed creator. There's that stereotype that critics are failed creators and that they would have rather been playwrights. My father had no interest in writing plays, no interest in writing a novel. For him, being a critic and writing criticism was a noble profession. It was a service profession. And it was something that he felt could be creative in its own right.
One of the things I want to talk specifically, there's an aspect that really, there's something that really struck me in the book is how this was the time, and I don't think it was just him at the time, but there was a freedom to be very harsh, particularly about Broadway and moneyed stuff that feel inconceivable now. Like in the equivalent, you write in review after review, indicted the incompetence, vulgarity, pretension, mendacity, and cowardice on exhibit year after year on Broadway. And I cannot imagine something like that being written now with that virulent, this. But at the same time, it's, you can only hit as hard when you love something.
Exactly, Elisabeth.
It feels like people always say, critics hate theater. No. Someone who writes this is not someone who hates theater. This is very clear. Someone who has very high ambitions for theater and feels let down by Broadway. Do you feel that, the game of like, what would he have written now? Like that feels moot because we'll never know. It's not possible. But do you feel, based on that context, that there was a certain freedom, that the relationship between Broadway critic and audience was different at the time? Because it feels that now there's a sense of like, we can't write a bad review because we could put people out of work. Or, it's this very complicated stuff happening. Like, do you have any thoughts about that?
I have so many thoughts about that, Elisabeth. So I will tell you that my father used to say, I'll never be the New York Times theater critic because I won't boost Broadway. So even at the time, he had a feeling I won't be able to keep that job because that job is basically an engine of commerce in some way.
Fascinating.
So I actually think the New York Times now has more freedom and there's more interesting takes and different voices. And it's not just one person who's rubber stamping or boosting or bolstering the big juggernaut that's coming to Broadway. At the same time, though, you absolutely pinpointed it, that my father's harshness came from a place of deep love and reverence for art. And what he described it in terms of art and truth. And remember in the beginning of the book, I talk about how he quoted George Bernard Shaw in this piece that he wrote called On the Necessity of Destructive Criticism, and which was published in 1961. And he talks about how the critic owes it to truth and art. Loyalty in a critic is corruption. So in other words, if you were loyal and you were saying, I'm going to put this, I was just reading the piece about Phantom that's in the New York Times about all the musicians that it's given these jobs to all along. My father would put that completely out of his mind. And he would say, and he had an ideal standard in his mind. And he wanted to boost and notice and recognize truly good acting, truly great directing, wonderful plays. He was very anti-hype in any way. But then, of course, Elisabeth, I talk in the book about how he loved Annie. So he had his contradictions, right?
Right.
Well,
he totally bought into that.
Right.
And loved
taste. It's all ultimately about, the peculiarity of taste. I wanted to just add, onto Elisabeth's question, the context too was important because theater was treated as a more urgently necessary form,
yes,
I think, by the culture in the 60s and before. And now it's not so much, it's always been the invalid. It's always been, that has been forever, but it feels even more fragile now. And there's an additional, that feels like an unfortunate additional responsibility when you're reviewing to be conscious of that always. And as we know that, does that lead to dishonesty? Does it mean that your father had more leeway to be himself in his reviews?
I think he did. I think that's such a good point. And I think especially post-COVID, we feel like we have to do everything to get people back in those seats and get people buying theater tickets. And I think my father absolutely, and he mentioned theater as invalid in a number of his pieces that he said, or The Ugly Stepchild or whatever, of like the arts criticism.
Same, right.
And for him, theater was absolutely vital. It was so important. And there was something about that live experience that you just could not replicate anywhere else. And, he was also the theater critic for The Nation.
Right.
In the 80s. And that's how I got to go to a lot of shows with him and observe him scowling as I was bopping along to the songs in Cats. Or, certain shows that he would deem okay to take his kids to, and then others that he would go to on his own. But I think you're right. I think there is this feeling now, this increased fragility of theater and this need that we all feel. I've written one piece about theater. I don't know if you've read it, but Charles McNulty was my dad's student at Yale School of Drama and is the theater critic for the Los Angeles Times and hired me to write a piece about Curious Incident as the mother of an autistic child. And so I wrote that piece and got to know the playwright and the actors in that show very, very well. And I loved writing about theater. And I thought, wow, I did feel this sense of sadness and diminishment when I looked at the theater critics that were working. And I was like, we need to value theater on the level of literature, on the level of art criticism, on the level of dance and all these things. And, you two managed, to be honest. You two managed to celebrate what should be celebrated. And I just read your piece, Elisabeth, about the Betty Smith play.
Oh, right.
And I loved it. Because, as you know, I write about Tree Grows in Brooklyn in my book and the movie of Tree Grows in Brooklyn. And I thought that review was such a brilliant, you eviscerated the parts that needed to be, you pointed out how there were virtues and there were merits. But Helen Shaw, I just read her review of The Sign in Sidney Brustein's Window, which my father wrote a scathing review of back in the day. And I think she mentioned my father's review in her piece. And she said something like, it doesn't do any good to say that something's better than it is. Right? That we need,
yes.
Right? And I thought that was so Richard Gilman and I loved it. It doesn't.
That's very true. And I think there's a tendency very often to desperately feel that you have to fluff up something.
Yep.
Becomes a Woman, that Betty Smith play, it's from a company that I tend to like. I felt the production was just not good at all. Like, not good. It was just actually it was really bad. But I felt actually that I was pulling my punches because I liked the company and I felt like they put so much work into this, like finding that play and putting this thing together. But there's some directing decisions in the play that are really don't make any sense. And I actually feel fortunate that I didn't have space to get into that. So I didn't
know how you feel.
I did not have to deal with that because I was like, oh, I'm at word count. That's it. That's all I can say for now.
I cannot tell you how much I identify. I'm a book critic, and I write for the Boston Globe mostly. I've written a little for the New York Times. And I know that feeling where you're like, oh, thank goodness I don't have to go into the long descriptions of why and how this fails and doesn't work for me because I'm at word count, so that's it. But I thought that review was respectful of the company, but really beautifully honest about the merits or lack thereof with that production. And I think that we are, as critics, performing a service for a public. And I think we are saving people time and, in your cases, saving people money. Right? They shouldn't spend on something they're not going to enjoy or they're not going to gain something from.
I'm curious, Priscilla, so you grew up with a dad you revered, obviously. You had, but you're also very clear-eyed about him. Mm-hmm. Did he allow you to form your own opinions? I mean, was that something that, about art, or was he... did he expect you to endorse his view? I mean, how much of a life did you have as an observer of the art that your father even was writing about?
That's a fantastic question, Peter. So, there were certain things that I knew he wouldn't like that I just wouldn't bring up with him because I wouldn't want to get into that debate. But he did. He always asked me when we went to shows together. Remember we went to the Incredible Feeling show by Elisabeth? And I remember him turning to me and saying, just without total poker face, so I had no idea what he was thinking, what did you think of this? And he really respected what my sister and I would say about various productions and shows, although I'm sure that we both, in a sense, we shared his taste because he trained our taste. Mm. So to a large extent, we did share his taste. But with Cats, for example, that his review was a lot more favorable than it would have been had he not had me as his theater date that day, because he could see how enchanted I was with it. However, I did not tell him that I went on to perform Memory at a camp talent show, because he did describe it as an obnoxious ballad in the pages of the New Yorker. The Nation. So, there are certain things I just didn't tell him.
Yeah, it's... it's interesting, as you're talking, I'm thinking about something, I'm projecting onto Richard Gilman because he had such a rich relationship with, I think, a very fertile time in theater in general and understanding, the linkage back much closer than we are to some of those, some of the classics.
Yes.
Did he have an objective standard? I mean, do you feel like there was something that he ascribed to a kind of idea of theater that was somewhat calcified, or could he change with it? You're describing even his reaction to your reaction to Cats as having an impact on him.
I think, it's funny. He wasn't trained in theater at all. He went to the University of Wisconsin and I think was an English major, but never went to grad school, didn't even end up graduating from college. And so developed his taste on his own as an autodidact and was especially, as you know, interested in modern drama and Ibsen. And his last full-length original book was on Chekhov. I don't feel that he had an objective standard. I actually really don't. I feel that it was something ineffable that he celebrated originality, taking risks, being innovative, being different, anything that commented on theatricality or theater per se, he was more interested in. Although, as you know, he also decimated shows that he thought were pretentiously trying to comment on theater or there's that quote in my book from his article about the Village Voice and the coverage of off and off Broadway. And some of these shows, he wasn't somebody who would just boost off Broadway because it was quote unquote innovative, right? He despised anything that reeked of pretentiousness or, oh, look how original and cool we are. He hated that.
Right.
And, he really could love, I talk about Annie in the book, but he loved Evita. I remember my parents going to see Evita when it was on Broadway. It was one of their last date nights before they split up. Right. And I remember him coming home and rhapsodizing about this Patty Lupone character.
Oh, that's great.
And Mandy Patinkin, he's like, what a singer. And I, he used to have me sing Don't Cry for Me, Argentina. From time to time. He's like, regale me, sing to me.
Were you a singer, Priscilla?
I was a singer, Peter, yes. I met Matthew Previn, Mia Farrow's son, because we were in a vocal jazz ensemble in high school.
Wow.
Together.
Course. No.
And I did a lot of musical theater. I wanted to be an actress, but my parents were like, nope. Not happening.
So
no.
you said that, okay, so you said that he had like a soft spot for Annie, but in the book you also write that for the most part what he championed was like kind of tough stuff.
Yes.
Like Strindberg and Brecht and Pirandello and Peter Handke, which of course I cannot even fathom anybody here doing a Peter Handke play, like especially now. But
yeah,
so
rather controversial these days.
Right.
Elisabeth.
But for the most part, what he was championing was, I would say, like high art.
Yes.
Do you feel that, did he have any interest? Okay, so Annie, but, and Evita, but like, did he have an interest in like what we would call pop culture, the pop culture of the 70s and 80s, like rock or pop? Like, was there an interest, or was it kind of for him completely separate from the higher aspirations of theater?
That's a great question too. There's that scene in my book where I talk about him taking us to E.T. and there's that preview for the Rolling Stones concert movie and he freaks out and he's like, get this jerk off. He hated the Rolling Stones. He loved the Beatles. He loved Bob Dylan. But he wasn't that interested. My sister and I hid our love of pop music. We'd never watched MTV at his house. We never told him we went to a Duran Duran concert. I kept all of that sort of cordoned off from him. He loved television, though. Loved television, watched The Jeffersons every day, was obsessed with Murder, She Wrote, Matlock, Columbo.
Of course. Come on. Columbo and Murder, She Wrote. The best.
Murder, She Wrote is brilliant, Elisabeth. I will go to my dying day saying that.
And you know that Murder, She Wrote and Columbo were created by the same two guys.
I did not know that.
Yes.
And I have never seen an episode of Columbo, so that will be my next binge watch.
But, I love this about your writing about your father, that he seemed to revel in the power. We tend to feel a little bit ambivalent, certainly at the very least, about having some kind of sword of Damocles over careers. You mentioned this wonderful incident in which Harold Brodke asked your father, and my jaw dropped because I couldn't imagine it wasn't facetious, but he asked your father on an occasion if he, Harold Brodke, were the greatest writer since Proust.
Yes.
And then he qualified it and said, well, the greatest writer of the 20th century since Proust. And your father gave a one-word answer after a pregnant pause. And the answer was?
The short and the long answer, Harold, is no.
I love that. It's just so great. It leads me. I want to read one paragraph from your book because I think it's so revealing. Surrounded by creative writers, did my father not feel inadequate? No, because he was the judge and they the judged. He the one they all turned to for advice, wisdom, validation. My father's approval meant everything to those who wanted to please him. He gave confidence to those who lacked it, courage to those who were fearful, reticent, or retiring. But he also destroyed confidence, inspired fear, and issued stinging put-downs in print. You wanted to be on his good side. I get when I read that there was a particular, if not pleasure, but satisfaction in having that kind of say over.
Absolutely. Oh, there was such satisfaction. And remember the story in my book where I talk about how he's sitting in his office at Newsweek back in the day. He had his nice, luxurious office at Newsweek. The phone rings and this woman is calling about, she says, I just want you to know that my niece, you wrote this terrible review of her performance and I want you to know that she's never had an acting lesson in her life. And my father said, oh, thank you very much. That explains everything. Goodbye. And he loved that story. He told it again and again. He loved it.
He was comfortable with power.
Comfortable with power. Absolutely. Yep. He inhabited that critic's role with aplomb and joy, Peter.
I can't think of anybody right now writing about theater who would have that same attitude. I really cannot think of that. And I know that readers often think, so-and-so is drunk with power. That is completely not true. That is so not true. Nobody, it's just not the case.
Elisabeth, it's not. And I just wanted to say that, he never had doubt about it. Like, I often, if I'm about to write a review and I'm not going to write a good review, I feel, oh gosh, but I know this isn't a really nice person. I feel so bad. I'm is this going to sing? I feel qualms about it. I don't think
absolutely. Yeah.
No.
Well, maybe that was also, why he felt, his perch. I remember first reading Richard Gilman in the Nation. That's where I first encountered him. So I know, and I remember thinking, that there was a depth and a scholarship, even if he wasn't a scholar, to what he wrote that really made him stand out and someone I wanted to read. So, there was that to that level too. It was really, there was an enjoyment of just massaging an idea.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yes. That
comes across in his writing. Can we talk a little bit? I wonder, I also wondered, you have this amazing scene you describe when you were 10 years old and your parents' marriage was breaking up and you and your sister the news had to be delivered in this very obviously traumatic way. Was this a household that ran so hot, that it was so intense with these two very ambitious parents who, had, incredible drive both in their own ways? I mean, and very different kinds of people, obviously. Was it destined to not be able to support those two, hot planets in the same Central Park apartment?
It was absolutely destined to fail. It was destined to implode. Peter, I'm very glad they did marry. They had me and my sister. We had 10 good years, but they should never have been married. They were so badly suited to each other. And, my mother married my father on the rebound. Donald Bartholomew broke her heart. And
Donald Bartholomew.
Isn't that crazy? And the way he did it was so cold and horrible. And my father, and it's crazy. I write later in the book about how, as I learn more about my mother's experience, and I have so much empathy for her marrying somebody that she's not in love with. And she tells my father, I'm not in love with you. And my father said something like, love fades, but companionship is what matters, or something. But my father was passionately in love with my mother. And so I would say it was a hot planet and a cool planet, Peter. And never the twain shall meet, perhaps?
Yeah. Well, there were other issues, as I highly recommend our listeners to pick up that book, because there's some fun stuff also. In addition to what we just mentioned. Actually, I have a question about the Yale School of Drama experience, because what can you tell us a little bit about because this is now, I don't know if that was the case then, but now it is such a powerhouse.
Yes.
And the kind of making of the American theatrical voice.
Yes.
For better or for worse. It is what it is, but it is a powerhouse.
Oh, yeah.
What was it like for him and what was he doing there? And what was it like for him to teach there?
Oh, Elisabeth, it was the great thing he loved most, was his affiliation with Yale. He was brought there by Robert Brustein. I actually found the hiring letter that Brustein sent to him. He had taught at Columbia. And he came to Yale in 1967. In the 60s and 70s, he actually taught actors and playwrights just as much as he taught dramaturgs and critics. Meryl Streep was one of his most beloved students. He taught Henry Winkler, directed Henry Winkler in a play. And, I have that anecdote in the book where I talk about how he was dismayed that Henry was doing Happy Days. And he was like, he could have done anything. And he was a great actor. And then he saw Henry in a restaurant. Henry was like, oh, Professor Gilman, my favorite teacher. And my father was like, whatever you do, Henry, I love it. From that point on. He, and he directed plays, and he taught Christopher Durang and Wendy Wasserstein, and did not like Wendy Wasserstein's plays at all. My mother went on to be Wendy's agent.
Oh my God!
Yeah, I mean, it's crazy.
Too good. This is too good. Wait, I'm optioning the rights. I'm optioning the rights to this nest of right now with all my savings, which are not enough. I'm sure you'll take you will take a 2-figure check, right?
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Oh yeah. Yes.
That was my era at Yale. I was there when your father was teaching, but I was undergraduate, and I saw, it was when Wendy and Chris Durang and Merrill were all there. So I have this vivid, that part of your story, is very, touches me at the point where, really where my dramatic ideas were being shaped.
Peter, I love that. And he taught undergrads in the 70s.
I know.
And he taught this huge lecture class. I mean, How Far Have the Mighty Fallen, you two? The most popular class at Yale was my father's modern drama lecture class. Oh. And at one point, he lived on this. He said, we had to move into Patel Chapel because there were so many students. And when I started at Yale as an undergraduate and I took the class that displaced his class, it was a class called Psychology and the Law, taught by the guy who's now the president of Yale. And I said, Daddy, I'm so sorry, but there's an article in the Yale Daily News. Your class has been displaced. It's not the most popular anymore. And I suddenly realized, I said, Daddy, I'm taking this psych and the law class in part because it's interesting, but in part because it's a gut. And I said, how many assignments did you give in your lecture class? And he said, it was like 2 short papers. I was like, okay. Right. But he did give scintillating lectures on Buchner and Brecht and Strindberg and Beckett as well. So he taught a lot. He taught Henry Louis Gates.
I love the idea of Yaleys like fighting to get a seat to like a Bruckner lecture. I mean, isn't
that incredible?
Awesome.
I know.
Well, for the professors who gave performances, so to speak, who really brought life to the lecture, those were cherished people at Yale. Vince Scully was another one.
I never got to take his class.
And I took his. I sat in on one of your father's lectures. I don't know why. God only knows. I think I was also very afraid of. I was an English major, and there was a real, at the time I went, a real line drawn between theater and English, literature.
That was still true when I was an undergraduate.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And it was terrible. And they looked down on the theater people in the English department.
Yes, they thought it was too practical. It was too practical.
Exactly. It was terrible. And now the chair, I am so happy to say that the chair of the Yale English department is my father's beloved doctoral student, Mark Robinson.
Wow.
Who wrote the book about the American play.
Amazing.
And he went over from the drama school and is joint appointment and is chairing the English department. So theater is I'm so glad that Yale is not putting theater in that invalid or ugly stepchild role anymore.
I also, we glossed over something you said, which I have to say, I have to think about. The critic's daughter was discouraged from being an actor.
Oh, yeah.
That's, you would think, armed for that life, completely prepared for the ups and downs. Was your father protecting you from that?
He was completely protecting me, as was my mother. And my mother actually went to Northwestern Theater. And she was there with Richard Benjamin, Paula Prentice.
Oh my God.
Karen Black. They were her classmates. And there was some notoriously cruel acting teacher and my mother was sitting in the audience watching her denigrate some performance. And my mother was like, I'm switching to the oral interpretation of literature as my major. And from that point on, I think it was something that both my parents agreed on. And I did some off-Broadway stuff when I was a little kid. I was recruited out of my ballet school, and I performed with the American Dance Machine when I was a kid. And I sang, and I did productions of Three Penny Opera and Marat Sade. My father was in heaven with that. Although I played a whore in Three Penny Opera. He didn't like that. But,
oh my God, you were in Marat Sade? Oh my God.
I was one of the singing narrators in Marat Sade. Yes.
Oh my God.
Oh, so it was good. So good. So good. And, but then when I went to Yale, I sang a little bit, but in the beginning, but then Melissa Errico was my classmate. And, and then I just stopped because both my parents were like, you are not going to be an actor. It's too unstable a life. You want to have kids. You need to use your brain. I'm like, don't actors use their brains? Come on. Like, there was so much snobbery involved in
use your brain.
Fascinating.
It was terrible. I was like,
they knew
Meryl
too much.
Hart? Come on.
Right.
But they were doing it out of love. And I think it was a way for me to sort of precariously unite my parents who had this very bitter divorce. I was like, well, I'm going to do something that they're both going to be pleased. I'm going to give up acting and singing. Mia Farrow came to see Marat Sade because Matthew Previn, who became my boyfriend, her son we were the singing narrators together. And she walked up to me with holding Suni's hand. And that was the first time I ever met Mia. And she said, "You're a very good actress." And I went home and told my mother, and she said, "I don't care if you're good. You don't want to do it."
I really wish we were. I mean, if this podcast had video, I think our listeners/viewers would have seen my jaw like just drop at this story.
Well, Priscilla, I just want to ask you one question about this because people may recognize you, your name or your voice from the HBO documentary Allen v. Farrow, in which you play a major role. I think you're a major witness in that story. And the one way Priscilla and I connected was I covered for the New York Times the custody trial between Woody Allen and Mia Farrow of Dylan Farrow many, many years ago. And I was on one side. Little did I know how much Priscilla was integral to the stories of the abuse of Dylan. And I just was curious. What was the fallout from that experience, Priscilla? Was it cathartic for you to be in that? I guess I should say alleged abuse. I don't know if I'm supposed to say, confirm it. I'm not a doctor. I believed Dylan's story. Let me just say that. But what was it like for you to have that experience after all those years to come back to it and have many of your memories sort of validated?
Peter, I have to say it was very traumatic living through the viewing of it. And I'm very close to Mia. I consider her like a second mother. My mom represents Ronan Farrow for books. And I have to say it was a grueling experience. It was before the vaccines. So everybody was watching it because no one was going out. It was like February, March 2021. It was airing. And we had recorded it 2 years earlier. And I had no idea where it was going to be. I just went in and did an interview. I didn't know it was going to be HBO. I didn't know anything. But it was cathartic. I feel like, and Dylan feels very much that many, many more people believe her now than believed her before. And I had wanted to share my experience being in that family. I had done some interviews before, but just to be able to have somebody listen and to see the full extent of what happened, I didn't even know. Like some of those recordings of me and Woody's conversations, I was watching on the phone with Dylan. We were texting each other and we both just started sobbing, hearing what Mia was going through. We didn't know. She protected us to a large extent from the worst of it.
Yeah, I came out of that. It was, even in the small part of it that I had, I hadn't realized how deeply it had affected me.
Exactly, Peter. I hadn't either. I moved on from it, and I don't put them in my book at all. We sort of cordoned it off deliberately. Norton didn't want that to be part of the story because I was going through that. Obviously, when my father had the heart attack, it was the same day that Woody Allen gave his press conference at the Plaza Hotel.
Oh my God.
There was so much going on. And I didn't realize how much it had affected me either. And I needed to process it. And I think being part of that docuseries, I was able to.
So what's next for you, Priscilla? Do you want to write more criticism? Do you want to write more theater stories?
I do. I actually have a call with my literary agent after we record to talk about my next book idea. So I will have more to divulge soon. But I love writing criticism. I would love to write more about theater. I'd love to write about film. And I do want to write children's books too one day. And books about literature.
But have you ever even considered writing a play?
Elisabeth, I started thinking about it recently. I started thinking about it. I've never studied creative writing in any way, but I don't think I'd want to write a screenplay, but a play, maybe. It would have to be innovative and original, or Richard Gilman would be scowling wherever he is. So I have to think about it.
I have a scene in mind. Wait, Priscilla, listen. Your mother signs a playwright, right? The mother in the story signs a playwright.
Okay.
And she comes home to tell her critic husband that she signed this playwright just as he's finishing his pan of a review of her play. There's the kind of, there's the flashpoint that really defines the conflict in the play. Anyway,
Peter, a series of scenes like that.
Yeah, exactly.
Another one could be when Gore Vidal wrote a scathing takedown of my father, and then my mother signed him as a client.
Of course.
It's so good. It's so
It's
good.
writing itself.
Yeah.
I'm optioning this one too for another 2-figure check.
Well, listen, thanks, Priscilla, for spending a little time with us. I cherish this book. Again,
this
it's
one has
called
it all,
The
like
Critic.
name dropping,
Everything.
depth, Yale theater,
New York egos.
clash of like gigantic egos, and the daughter who survived them all.
Shocking secrets, Elisabeth.
Shocking
Yes, exactly.
Dramatic revelations.
Exactly.
Oh my God.
All of
It's so much.
oh
my God.
It's called The Critic's Daughter, published by Norton. And our guest has been Priscilla Gilman. Thank you so much, Priscilla.
Oh my God, thank you so much.
You two have my favorite podcast and my son James's favorite podcast. He's thrilled I'm recording with you both.
Yes.
Oh,
Yes.
that's so nice.
Success.
Okay, well, that is a really, really fun read. And that was a fun interview, a memoir about really a time that doesn't exist anymore, when it felt like critics roamed the earth like giants.
A time that's receding from memory very quickly, I would say.
I don't know how you feel, Elisabeth, but that this question of, I think the interesting question you asked about, you could be this, you could wield a knife, you could wield a stiletto as a critic and slice and dice much more not viciously, but with a lot more point of view. It's not, I think social media has made that difficult. I think also the maybe the tone policing that goes on in the culture makes, it would peg you as a crank too quickly. It's very hard to maintain, as you say, that temperament. It runs a little too hot maybe for this era.
I think it would be impossible too, because one would be accused of wielding one's power too casually. Mm-hmm. And I think now it's really perceived as wielding power. I don't think that's an accurate interpretation of what's happening, but that is how it is perceived. And I think a huge difference is also now like fandom has a much more powerful voice, and ways to hit back. Every show has their fans, some of them very passionate and very vocal, which is great. They're very quick to strike back, I think, and accusing critics of all kind of evil I don't think writing like that is possible. I don't know. And of course, for a lot of people would say, well, that's a good thing. That is a good thing that it's not possible anymore. So there's that.
There's also, the other thing that I think we should think about is, the price, the theater it monetarily is so much more expensive today. There were so many other factors that have changed the sort of the equation between, and the marketing is so much more sophisticated than it was back in the day when critics really were essential to they were the bedrock of the word of mouth and the promotion of a show. I think that's changed the calculus too for everyone. I also wanted to say I don't agree that Sidney Brewstein is a bad play. I just want to make that clear. To the point that, you have to say a bad play is a bad play, I agree with, but we don't all agree with what a bad play is.
Exactly. But the problem you see is that there's so few critics left, or professional full-time critics, that you end up speaking in a vacuum. Right. Who are you going to argue about Sidney Brewstein with? I mean, in terms of other critics, I mean, because you can't engage with every single viewer of that show. It's just not possible. I mean, there's just too many, so who are the others? But there's nobody else. And actually, I also did happen to like the play. I like the second half a lot more than the first, actually.
Me too.
But I'm very happy it's there. I'm very happy it was done. And I mean, I don't think it's great, but it was definitely very much worthy of a production.
Yeah. It's not a great play, but it's certainly an interesting play, and there's got to be room for that as well on the spectrum of things that people choose to see.
And very often the interesting plays are the ones that stay with you, as opposed to the good plays. There's something about the imperfections that
I agree. I totally agree. I see that's where it becomes an even a deeper and a question to pursue, and it's why it's great that a person like Priscilla Gilman writes about so effectively, so evocatively about another time in the continuum of criticism. It's I'd say a great book for drama schools to sort of be putting on their
I fully agree. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, listen. This was another, really fun chat. Lively. My adrenaline's going here in a way that it wasn't before.
I'm going to have like 3 coffees to calm down now.
Right. Well, so thank you all for listening. We hope you'll come back for the next conversation. Please click on marksvincentelli.substack.com and subscribe to our podcast if you don't already.
And you can follow us on Twitter. Yeah, we're still there, where we post updates. We tend to announce. We announce when the podcasts are out. We also, oh my God, there's so much gabbing. On Twitter, I'm at evincentelli, and Peter is at Peter Marks Drama. Ta-ta for now.